Welcome back. This time we're talking about the Pirates of the Caribbean film franchise. I just posted my review of the fifth film in the series, Dead Men Tell No Tales, and this time I want to talk about the franchise as a whole, and specifically I want to rank these films from my least favorite to my most favorite. And let me say, because I'm going to be talking about all five films, there will be spoilers in this video. I will try to keep the spoilers for the latest film, Dead Man Tell No Tales, to a minimum, but I'm going to consider the other four films fair game. So if you have not seen them and don't want significant plot points spoiled, stop watching now, go watch the films. So with that being said, let's move forward. Starting the list at number 5, meaning it's my least favorite of the films, and that would be the fourth film in the franchise, On Stranger Tides. Now let me preface this by saying the original trilogy is honestly one of my favorite trilogies. I realize it has its flaws, but for sheer entertainment value, I really enjoy those three films. The fourth film, when it came out, it's the first one not directed by Gore Verbinski. It definitely has a slightly different feel to it. And for me, it has some significant flaws when it comes to the script. The most glaring of that is a series of instances where characters know things that they really have no right knowing. Like with a lot of the films, this story is basically centered around a group of groups all trying to find the same thing, in this case, the Fountain of Youth. In a lot of ways, this is almost an identical setup to the second film in the franchise, Dead Man's Chest, in that basically the early portion of the film is setting up why our various characters are searching for the MacGuffin. In that case, it was Davy Jones' key. In this case, again, it's the Fountain of Youth. And specifically with the character of Barbossa, he is leading a ship of English soldiers, and they basically make it to everywhere they need to go. They do have Gibbs's memory of the map, but Jack had that map for years and seemingly did not know any of the other particulars except for the location. But aside from those issues, my biggest gripe with this movie is that Jack himself played too large a role in the overall film. I enjoy the character of Jack Sparrow. I like Johnny Depp's performance. I really feel he brings a lot of emotion to his characters, even the ones that are outlandish and weird. And I really don't think he gets enough credit for the emotion he brings to these strange and weird characters. But as a character to drive a film, I find that he does better playing the wild card catalyst that sort of drives all of the other characters forward and their stories forward. Basically what he was doing in The Curse of the Black Pearl, as well as, basically 2 and 3. He carrying a film it just doesn't work as well for me. This wouldn't be such a big issue in this film, except for the fact that aside from Barbossa, all of the surrounding characters in this movie are not really that interesting. I did not find Blackbeard a very compelling villain, and his daughter. And speaking of her character, there's just a lot of inconsistencies with character motivations and why people are doing what they're doing. It just, if you think about it for very long, a lot of what happens in this movie really doesn't make a lot of sense. Now obviously there have been things like that in all of the films, but it's most telling in this one, and it really hurt my overall enjoyment of the movie, and that's why it's at number 5. I don't hate this movie. I, in fact, enjoy all of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, but this is definitely my least favorite. So moving on to number 4, that would be the latest film in the franchise, Dead Man Tell No Tales. If you've seen my review of that film, you'll know that I felt it did improve on some of the things I did not like in On Stranger Tides, which included the plot inconsistencies and issues with characters knowing things that they shouldn't, as well as providing us some more interesting characters. I did find that the villain was not much more compelling than Blackbeard, and the overall pacing is kind of off and definitely front loaded. The whole madcap adventure that all of these films tend to start with dragged on for quite a while and did not leave enough time for a satisfying conclusion. And honestly, I feel that the conclusion itself was a little anticlimactic. Moving on to number 3 on my list, that would be the second film in the franchise, Dead Man's Chest. This film has a lot of similarities with On Stranger Tides as well as Dead Men Tell No Tales, in that it's basically setting up all of our various characters and groups to all be wanting the same thing so we can have this race to the finish line. In this case, it is trying to find a key to a chest possessed by Davy Jones, which contains his heart, although we don't know that until much later in the film what's actually in the chest. And a somewhat similar complaint to my pacing issues with Dead Man Tell No Tales, I do feel like the opening bits of this movie do drag a little bit. The whole adventure with the native cannibals is fun, has some good adventure and some swashbuckling action, but honestly, you could cut that entire segment and the movie would not be much if any different. In fact, that's really one of the only scenes I can think of any of the movies where you could just cut completely and you really would not even notice it. It's a fun sequence, but in a 2.5 hour movie, it's a noticeable thing that it's like, that could have been cut and it would have been fine. I do overall enjoy the movie. I don't enjoy it, obviously, as the 2 films that have not yet been mentioned. In a lot of ways, you could actually compare this film to Empire Strikes Back, where you have our heroes victorious in the first film and are now facing a more determined empire. In this case, it's the British Empire. And our characters are not faring well. We start out with Will and Elizabeth being arrested, having to go on this whole adventure at penalty of death if they don't succeed. And the film basically ends with one of our heroes being not frozen in carbonite, but locked up in Davy Jones' locker. And the rest of our heroes forming a plan to rescue him as we go to credits. It's actually pretty comparable when you think about it. One of the things I did find, and it's retroactive, like I didn't realize it was a problem until I saw the third film. But really, these films really work their best when Jack is playing against Barbossa. When they're on screen together is some of the best moments of this entire franchise. Johnny Depp and Jeffrey Rush have such great chemistry playing rivals that it just elevates the whole movie. Their banter that we get in the third film definitely elevates that film, and one of the things I really like about it. And so it's one of the things, like, as you're watching it, if you're watching them in order, you don't know that you're missing it until you get to the third one and go, oh wow, the second one would have been even better if we had Barbossa in this movie. So I'm really glad he returns at the end of this film, but this one definitely is my third favorite. And that takes us to my second favorite, and this was actually a very close decision. This is actually probably the closest decision. This is the one, for trying to rank these, this was the hardest 2 to rank, was 2 and 1. Because I could definitely make arguments for either of these to be number 1, and I can't really make too many arguments against them because I love both of these films. And it was a very, very, very close decision to place at number 2 At World's End. The only real reason that this is not number 1 is because it's not really a standalone movie. It really relies on what happens in Dead Man's Chest, and it is the conclusion of that story. It's a 2-part story, so that was basically the reason why Black Pearl got the nod higher up on the list. But this is a film I thoroughly enjoyed in theaters and have been thoroughly enjoyed every time I've watched it since. This is a very long movie. This is 2 hours, 40 minutes. And I've heard all of the complaints about it being convoluted, about it being weird. This is Gore Verbinski at his finest and his weirdest, at least within this franchise. It is definitely a story that you have to pay attention to. And I don't know if I truly got all of the backstabbing and betrayals and fake betrayals all worked out to maybe even the third time I watched this movie. Because there are so many betrayals, so many turns over the course of this very long story that you have to really pay attention to it. But I love that Gore Verbinski and the writers for this movie just decided to go for it and do things that you've got to remember. This is 10 years ago, and just several years before that, Black Pearl was Disney's first ever PG-13 under its Disney name. And now in the third film in this franchise, it starts out with a mast hanging, including a child. I remember seeing this in the theater and seeing how that was the sort of cold opening for this movie, and went, "Holy crap, that is different." And I liked it. I don't advocate the hanging of children. I'm just saying it was a gutsy way to start this movie, and I endorse that gutsiness because we get to see that throughout this film, especially in the very weird sequence when we see Jack in Davy Jones' locker. But this is a film I thoroughly and absolutely, again, as I've said several times already, enjoyed. I love just about everything about this movie. It has a great conclusion to the character arcs of Will and Elizabeth. I think, especially with Elizabeth, it is a great character arc, seeing where she starts at the beginning of Black Pearl. You know, she was never a true damsel, but she was a relatively sheltered nobleman's daughter, governor's daughter. And here, again, as I said in my when comparing Dead Man's Chest to Empire Strikes Back, this is the Return of the Jedi without the Ewoks, because they're like those two films. There's a time gap between the second and third films. In the case of Star Wars, you had Luke becoming a Jedi Knight. Here, we see Will and Elizabeth really embracing this pirate lifestyle. We meet up with them in Singapore, and Elizabeth she's pretty bad, I gotta say. She was fun to watch. You know, she has evolved as a character. No, we didn't get to see all of that evolution, but I find the character arc for her and Will very satisfying. We have a very involved storyline that ultimately leads to my favorite sequence in the entire franchise, and that is the Maelstrom battle between the Pearl and the Flying Dutchman. When that came out, the special effects were phenomenal, and they hold up pretty darn well even 10 years later. And even better, this story that they start in the first film, pick up in the second, and rely on the third to conclude, they nail the landing. It's not the perfect happy ending that you perhaps would hope for these characters, but it really works. And it was one that I went out and, I was sad that Will is going to be cursed and take on the Flying Dutchman, but it's still such a satisfying conclusion to what's essentially a 7.5 or so hour saga. I mean, it was a perfect conclusion to this trilogy and just made a great bookend. They could have ended it there and we would have been fine. We don't need any more films. I will continue to watch them. And as I've obviously shown, to me at least, none of them have reached that same pinnacle of quality. But for here, this is a film I really enjoyed. I like everything about it. The music is great. I bought the soundtrack as soon as I saw it originally. I still have it. It is a film that I really, really enjoy. And that leaves us with number one on this list, and that is Curse of the Black Pearl. This is a film that, again, I really liked. I mean, it was sort of a risk because I mean, pirate films. I mean, this was 2003 when this first film came out, and I mean, pirate films were sort of passe. Yes, this was based on a Disney ride, but had that ever worked out? And it hasn't really worked out since. So going into this, I was like, "Holy crap! This is really fun." It had great swashbuckling action, a great introduction to a character in Jack Sparrow. We had other great characters. We had Barbossa. We had Will Turner and Elizabeth Swann. We had all the various pirates. Norrington. It was just such a fun movie, and and like I said, the main reason, the one thing that sort of just bumped this up over At World's End is that this is a confined story. You don't need to see two films to enjoy it. You can just sit down and watch this self-contained story, and it's just really really fun. Some of the inconsistencies that get added as the later films came out aren't there. This is a pretty solid film script wise, and there's just so many little touches, like Jeffrey Rush's acting when Barbossa is killed. I mean, this is a character that we have no reason to really sympathize. We saw him sack the city. He was, not terribly nice to Elizabeth. He was not nice to pretty much anyone else. But when he feels the pain of being shot and drops that apple, it was impactful. And it was something that wasn't really necessary, but just, again, it was these little touches between the actors, the writers, the special effects. Admittedly, the special effects don't hold up quite as well as the later films, but considering this film came out 14 years ago, they hold up pretty darn well. And it's just a film I thoroughly enjoy. And as I've said, overall, this is a franchise I really, really enjoy. The first three films are definitely one of my favorite franchises of all time. And as a franchise as a whole, these are films that I can just sit back and enjoy. If they're on TV, I tend to just, if I turn the channel, it's on. I pretty much end up watching it to the end. I really enjoy these films. If they're going to keep making them, I'm going to keep watching them, and not just because I review movies, but as a franchise I really enjoy. So let me turn it over to you at this point. How would you rank these 5 films? What's your favorite? What's your least favorite, and why? As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other reviews, and until next time, I'll see you at the movies.